So I'm very pleased to be here with you today, and thank you so much for the warm welcome. And it was really interesting to follow the discussions that you've had yesterday and this morning. And I'm very pleased and happy and grateful to Andrew and the team for bringing this topic on board to discuss with all of you today. So what we will be discussing, I have Simon here with me, who is an external international advisor for the Internet Universality Indicators. And what we will do today is I'll just give you a very quick overview of the Internet Universality Indicators. And we will then focus on a regional report for the South Pacific mainly that we have prepared following national assessment in 5 South Pacific countries. And the idea would be to hear back from you on the findings and recommendations and to have the discussion with you and take on board your input as we go forward with the findings and recommendations. So we will have 2 parts today. So we will just have this overview and hear back from you on the report, on the findings and recommendations. And in the second part of the workshop, we would like to have you divided in groups to have maybe more targeted input from you on the questions related to the findings and recommendations. And what we will do with these inputs, we will take them on board if there are things that need to be implemented in the report. We will be ready then to incorporate and publish it. So this also serves as a launch of the report, but considering that your input is very important, we have many of you from these 5 countries and beyond who have contributed to the report. Of course, it's based on the national ones, but in addition, you've reviewed and gave your feedback, but it would also be very important to have a wider discussion and have your feedback. So I will just then get started with UNESCO's Internet Universality Indicators. I have been asked a few questions about why UNESCO is doing things related to Internet or digital transformation at all, considering that UNESCO is probably more known for its cultural activities or programs, culture and education. So just to briefly mention that UNESCO receives its mandate from 194 countries, member states, and all of your countries are member states, and they give us the mandate and the priorities to work on in member states. And one of these programs is communication and information, within which we work on freedom of expression and safety of journalists, media diversity, and media in crisis situations, media and information literacy and digital skills, universal access to information and documentary heritage, and where I work is digital transformation and digital policies. And what we do within this section is, again, based on the mandate that our member states give to us and based on the priorities that they define for us, based on the national needs. We provide support to member states with, for example, their digital policies or capacity strengthening in digital skills. We have a lot of focus on artificial intelligence and other emerging topics or technologies. So the Internet Universality Indicators, it summarizes UNESCO's position on the Internet, which, based on the decision of the member states, is the Internet should be based on rights. It should be open to all and accessible to all, and it should be nurtured by multi-stakeholder participation. So this is the position of UNESCO, and based on these guidelines, UNESCO then Secretariat has put together this Rome indicators, and we added an X category for cross-cutting issues such as gender equality, environment. And these indicators were formed following a 3-year consultation process to make sure that we incorporate the voice and feedback and input of everyone globally. So we had consultations for 3 years in every region of UNESCO. So this is where it comes from, and it is very much contributing to the achievement of UN Sustainable Development Goals. For example, we contribute a lot to, for example, the Sustainable Development Goal of free and just institutions, but also on to education and many other indicator of goals, considering the comprehensiveness of the indicators. And now, what is the indicators and why is indicators important and unique? So this is a set of indicators, and I'll just give another overview, and I will unpack it, but just for you to know, as I mentioned, it is endorsed by UNESCO member states, which is all of your countries. And it is measuring the legal, policy and regulatory frameworks. It is also unique in measuring human rights through a multi-stakeholder approach. And I apologize for those who have been part of the national assessments and who have seen some of the things that I'm saying. But it does also contribute greatly to closing the digital divide and contributing to digital inclusion by also having this comprehensive approach and inclusive methodology in the assessment process itself. And it gives a solid evidence-based approach to policy making, which is also another unique approach. And I must mention that in its nature, this framework is unique, is a unique tool. But of course, it's not aiming to replace other internationally available tools. For example, those who try to measure, for example, connectivity from the technical perspective, or the other tools that are out there from other international organizations, but it's rather a complementary tool with others to help the member states to get a comprehensive overview. We have a set of 300 indicators, over 300 indicators, and what we call over 100 core indicators. The reason why we have core indicators is because we believe that in order to have a basic yet comprehensive understanding of the internet development in a country, which I must highlight is a voluntary process. So the initiative or interest comes from the country. It's not imposed, and it is a voluntary process, and it is not for the purpose of ranking. It remains at the national level, except for this regional report, which does not do ranking, but rather does an analysis to give an opportunity also to see where we could learn from each other, or where there are common gaps that we could work together. But overall, it never does a ranking, and it is really tailored. And the reason why we have these 303 indicators is that in addition to these 100 indicators, member states or the stakeholders have the freedom to choose and implement additional indicators based on the national context, cultural context, social and other aspects taking into consideration. So we do the analysis, and then based on the evidence found, we propose policy recommendations for different stakeholder groups, and these policy recommendations are actionable to the extent possible, so that you can have either immediate or midterm, sometimes long-term impact by implementing these recommendations. And then so it gives this holistic approach and evidence-based approach to policy making. So this is just to give you an idea of how it's structured. So we have these 5 categories that I mentioned, and within each category, for example, within rights, we address legal and regulatory framework, we address freedom of expression, or for example, in openness, we measure, for example, even open markets. In cross-cutting, as I said, for example, gender equality, environment, and others, but I won't bore you with this, just so you know that we have all these themes. And to make it easy for anybody to use, then we have the guiding questions, which are then complemented by all of these indicators. And here you can have a better overview of the themes. I'll allow you to take a photo, but I'm happy to also share the slides and also to give a link to, if you search on UNESCO's Internet Universality Indicators, that's the only thing that will come up normally. So about the process, so it's a bit of a long process because we don't just focus on the results, we also focus on the process. So we start by, of course, when there is interest from the member state, and it doesn't have to be the government, it can be any stakeholder group. We've implemented it in over 40 countries. In some places it's been initiated by civil society, like the Internet Society. It can be really diverse stakeholder group that initiates the process, but an important step and the most critical step is to establish the multi-stakeholder advisory board, which has to be composed of all the relevant stakeholders, including the government, civil society, private sector, academia, and others. And it can be, there are key stakeholders, which are key stakeholders in every country, but depending, of course, on the context of the country and cultural context of the country, there can be other stakeholder groups. And then it can be from 6 months to 9 months, because so we have qualitative aspects, qualitative indicators, and also quantitative. But in addition to desk research, the multi-stakeholder advisory board, or as we call it, MAB, meets now and then to give guidance to the research team where the data is not there, or to not validate, but to discuss the data and to make sure that they guide the process and they are part of the process. But the purpose is not to lead the process, but to rather steer the process. And so finally, after a few months of the research, we have the validation workshop, which again gathers all the multi-stakeholder advisory board members, and where people then discuss and validate the findings and also the recommendations, and own up to the recommendations, because to the implementation of the recommendations, which are meant for improving the situation. So, and then we have the last element, which comes at a later stage after the assessment, which is impact measurement. Regarding the publication process, so we have so it's an open resource, the indicators, and anyone is free to take and use it, of course, by acknowledging the copyright. But many of the countries all of the countries have acknowledged the importance of working with UNESCO on this, and we've been publishing most of the reports. So that part also goes with UNESCO, which then ensures the quality process and all these steps related to the publication. This is just a map I took the screenshot, so I'm not sure if we can see, probably not very well, the 5 Pacific islands that we've been doing the assessments in. But this is a map, a snapshot of the countries that have done the assessment. What I must highlight is, considering its comprehensive approach, it's relevant to any country in any level of their digital development. For example, the assessment was done and then the recommendations of the assessment were implemented, for example, by Germany. The assessment was done by France, for example. So no matter the development of the digital landscape, it is helpful and useful for any country, considering that it gives a really comprehensive overview. It does have tailored recommendations drafted by the national stakeholders, not by UNESCO. This is these are not all the reports, but this is approximately how, not approximately, this is how the reports look like. So far, we have been aiming for example, a 100-page document, but most of the reports are over 200 pages. With a record of 200 pages, over 300 pages for Mongolia, which is not here. So again, you can, if you search, you can see them and read through the documents. These are just a few of the examples of, impact of IUI assessments. We have countries, many countries actually, and I don't have all of the examples here. We have countries where, for example, laws were established following the recommendations of the assessments. For example, one of the most recent ones, for example, in Niger, we had the latest example where the online defamation was criminalized, for example, or the assessment in Brazil led to the personal data protection law enforcement. So we have all of these few examples, and we have many more in basically every country where we've done the assessment, even before the publication, before the report was published. As the gaps were identified and recommendations were drafted, we have seen positive impact. Now about the Pacific. So since last year, we have been implementing this assessments in 5 South Pacific islands: Fiji, Tonga, Vanuatu, Tuvalu, Solomon Islands, and it's 5? Okay. So we have Swaran here, who has been the national lead researcher for Tuvalu, Solomon Islands, and Fiji. And we have Doreen here, who has been the lead researcher. Doreen. So we don't have Doreen? Doreen here, who has been the lead researcher for Vanuatu. And I must thank you both for your hard work and dedication and in driving these assessments forward. And I must acknowledge all the people who have served in the multi-stakeholder advisory board in all of these countries and contributed to the assessments. And even if you weren't in the multi-stakeholder advisory board officially, we've received valuable feedback and contributions from many of you, and we're truly grateful for that. And it is a national product drafted and crafted by people of your countries and led by our lead researchers from the region. And the recommendations have also been crafted by you. But how we were able to do this project was through a joint Sustainable Development Goal Fund project implemented by 6 UN agencies. And this project aims to support the economic diversification in these 5 countries. And I've been asked why these countries, and it's very simple, simply because the Office of the Resident Coordinator in Fiji, where the project was drafted, covers these 5 countries. So there are other projects that are ongoing in other parts of the region, covering different other topics. So there was no specific other reason for having the assessments in these countries. And so it's implemented. It's a very big project, and it's implemented by 6 UN agencies, and UNESCO is contributing to a cultural element, which is related to creative industries, and also this digital transformation component, which contributed to these national assessments in these 5 countries. So I have a slide here about the role of the IUI, and I covered it a little bit. So it's basically just to reinforce the role of the IUI. It's basically nationally driven, multi-stakeholder driven assessment, which is tailored and aimed at giving the country a comprehensive overview. And as you map the situation in country, then you are able perhaps to think of the priorities, because there may be instances where there are many gaps, but then you have your own priorities and areas of focus. So it helps to identify the most critical gaps, and also help identify the solutions to some of the gaps, and to help adopt evidence-based approach in closing these gaps, and evidence-based approach to policy making. And what's also important, as I said, is the process that brings together around the same table all these multi-stakeholder representatives to talk to each other through the process, discuss the data recommendations, and then to work together beyond the research to implement all of these various recommendations, which can be shared with among different stakeholders, like you will see in case of the regional report. So I'm sorry I talked a lot, but here is the report, the summary of the regional report that you have received, probably. I sent it yesterday by email, and we don't have enough copies with us, but we distributed a few, and which will serve as basis for your discussion this afternoon, and of course if you have questions also now. So based on these national reports that we've worked on, and Doreen and Swaran, and also in Tonga, Mele and Selu, I won't recall their last names, but I'm sure that many of you know them, as they are very motivated young ladies driving many of the initiatives forward. So these were based on the recommendation, on the main findings and recommendations of these national reports. But of course, in addition to the national reports, there was a lot of work done in addition to the national reports, and the work done by Simon Ellis, who is an international advisor. So he has many, of course, I think many qualities, but for the IUI context, he is an international advisor, external consultant for internet related matters, who then put together this regional report. And I will hand over to him to unpack a little bit the findings and recommendations of the report. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel like I'm kind of from the same generation as those people who spoke on the first day, and the kind of internet pioneers in the region. But unfortunately, I wasn't amongst those pioneers, and I should have retired. I did retire in 2012, but I didn't really, and I'm carrying on. And I'm carrying on things because no, I'm an independent consultant. I can say what I like about UNESCO, but I get involved with things I believe in. And I really believe in this, and I really believe in the region, and I hope that will come out from what I say. But equally well, I'm not from the region. I'm trying to summarize what all these researchers who worked on the project and all of you who contributed to the advisory board have put into all of this. And that I'm adding in, if you like, the more global perspective without, as we said, we're trying to rank or compare in any ways. So I hope that it's a hard job because I really don't want to seem patronizing. I don't want to seem to be somebody, an external person, saying things to you when you know what's really going on. But at the same time, as in all these kinds of strategies, we want to have something which has an impact, which shows a way forward and which makes a difference. So that's the spirit in which I'm trying to approach this. So as Tatovik has said, this is coming from the national reports that have been produced. It's gathering together the main findings and challenges within the region. And I've spoken a little bit to other people here to see in other countries in the region whether some of the things chime with them. And we hope that this will serve to present a pathway forward, which you'll all be able to relate to. So I always like to start in this because this is what I think the internet does to the Pacific. So this is, I guess, me as much as anything else. I think that we want to see all the islands connected here, and within the country, if all the islands are connected, this is almost the internet for the first time can create a truly national dialogue where all the islands, no matter what the gap between them, can be online in one meeting, in one forum. So I think that's the first thing that the internet can do. And in a sense, the early initiatives that Ian was talking about yesterday show this initial through undersea cables how things are moving, and this in a way will perhaps suggest other steps forward. I think the other thing is that it is the first time the internet allows anyone in the Pacific to talk directly to the world and the world to see what's happening in the islands. And that's really important because before the internet and before the broadband, if you like, or fiber, it's not possible for people to really see directly. You've had to go through middlemen in other countries. And then also, in terms of the UN project, it's the first time Pacific countries can market their products and services and culture directly. So again, when those products and services go out, if they're going out through the internet, all the detail of who made things, who did things, the context, the environment in which they did it, the village in which they live, all of that is there. And I think this is vital for me personally. I think that all this creates an atmosphere in which the Pacific countries and particular islands can be seen fully for the first time. And I think that's, for me, is the ambition here. In the first day, I think it was Rico talked about the initial setting up and the number of votes that were put together, all the Pacific countries together. And I know from UNESCO and from many UN operations that Pacific countries, as countries, can get forgotten about very easily. And the internet is the way in which that can be changed. And I think that the richness of culture, the richness of activity, and the richness of life here can be seen and needs to be seen by other people in the world. And it needs to be seen at the global level too. And what UNESCO in a way, or the UN as a whole, and not necessarily to stick just to UNESCO, can do is to highlight that in a way. I'll come back to that a bit later on. So what I've done here is I've kind of grouped together loosely related to the theme of the IUI and some of the recommendations here. So what we're doing both here now in this session and then in groups would be to try and get your feedback. As I said, I'm I'm very conscious of being an outsider. I'm building on the reports which everybody has done within the countries. And what we want to say also is have we got it right? Everybody has their views here, but also outside the countries that were particularly part of the study, does this make sense, what we're saying? Can we nuance it better to make a more useful recommendation? And then these recommendations in due time will then go up to the global level in different fora. And again, I will discuss that a bit more. So the first theme, which is the rights theme in IUI, is kind of governance, legislation, regulation. So the first thing is gaps. So we know that most of what we see from the reports is that most of the countries rely on the national constitutions for establishing those human rights. But we know that many of those constitutions were written some time ago and often before the internet. So there is a need to look at putting in place specific laws which take those principles and embed them in internet practice, if you like. And I think the biggest gap that for me, it seems, is data protection. And we heard again yesterday from Tonga that is in course. And I think, and some of the other countries have things which touch on data protection. But again, the sense of specific laws which now exist in many countries of exactly how to protect data online, both consumer data, both data which is submitted to governments, and then access to that data in various forms that is there. We also see throughout the Pacific, again, that while the laws are there and the Constitution may be fair, the enforcement can be difficult for lack of resources. And throughout many countries in IUI, and I've been involved in certainly over 20 countries across the world in working with them on the reports. There is a lack of the training needed for officials, for judges, for the police to adapt what they know about activities and offences, if you like, in the physical world to the online world, and how that goes across. So I think part of the enforcement issue here then is about lack of resources, and I think that is a question directly for countries. And then there's training for the officials on there, in which is one area where UNESCO can help. One of the other themes which is really important, which I think has come out many times already in discussions over the last day or two, is transparency. I mean, we said we're not comparing, but in the work that I've done with other countries, it's been easy to find much of the data that is required of the fundamental data. So numbers of phone subscriptions, numbers of people using the internet, numbers of registered top-level domain names, country-level domain names. But it's much more difficult to find this. I think all the research teams have been involved here have found difficulty in that. That data, we're talking, again, you must remember, about a multi-stakeholder environment. So in terms of the way forward, in terms of looking at the internet development, having that data freely available is essential. One quick example there, in the case of top-level domains and domain names, we need to look at, and all countries are facing this issue, which again has to come up in discussion, as to local businesses. So what proportion of the top domain names in Fiji, in Vanuatu, Tonga, wherever, are local businesses rather than businesses that have been established overseas? And we know that the domain names have been, because of their resonances at the international level, it's got to such a stage that in some cases, when people from your countries have been to international meetings, that people don't even think of that two letters at the end as being a national domain name, which is clearly a ridiculous state of affairs. So all that data needs to be out there so that people can see it. And in terms of one of the things I will come back to is about business startups. So in broadening out the economy, in the online economy, one wants to know what proportion of those domain names are local businesses. One wants to encourage local businesses to have a domain name which is a .tv, a .to rather than a .com. And we want to see who those businesses are and encourage the growth of those businesses. In e-government, the need for more interactive sites. This again is not limited by any means to the Pacific, but the sense in which, in many cases, initial ministry offerings are simply a description of what the ministry does and so on. In some cases, the next level then would be to allow submission of reports or to get reports or policy documents from those sites. And then the third level is a very much an interactive process, so actually applying for licenses, commenting on reports, and then being able to get feedback from the ministry, depending on which organisations are doing that. But obviously, in this environment, in the region, there are many communities which still don't have proper access which allow them to do that. And in terms of online transactions, there are still issues about banking. Even if the facility is there, people may not know how to use it, or people may worry about it. So those kind of two are interlinked and in going forward. So just to say this sense of data and what it means, this is a quick example from Fiji. In the last few weeks, I've seen that the Fiji Communications Authority, the Telecoms Authority, put online more recent data on number of subscriptions. And what you see here is the orange line shows that all subscriptions, all phone subscriptions, has shot up enormously since 2023. But if you look at active subscriptions per 100 population, it's the same. So what's happening here? I mean, and I since it's only they could really say what this is, but some ideas. We know, we learned from in the meetings that we held, that in some cases tourist SIMs are included in the count. So maybe it's tourist SIMs. The other question here is it a post-COVID scenario? And then is it somehow that people have subscriptions which they've dropped and then they're taking out new subscriptions which then become the active ones? But something has changed and in the last couple of years. So clearly there's something here that this data is clearly central to some kinds of policy decisions depending on how you interpret the trend. So I want to move on relatively quickly. We will come back and you'll see in the how these relate to more specific recommendations and national reports and so forth later on. So openness is a bit more difficult as a category to describe because it includes both the sense of an open market, but also things like open source software and open data. And so these pick out some of those threads, if you like. I've already mentioned this sense of transparency. So annual reports, I know annual reports by regulators and domain name registers, telephone companies take time to prepare, but they are, again, this essential fuel for fueling the internet development and for fueling policy, and it's difficult to find them in the countries involved here. One of the issues then, the next bullet point, we ask about different software licensing arrangements. So support for open source software. Now, we know that this isn't a kind of given, and this is it can be a double-sided sword. So if you have proprietary software, whether it be Microsoft Office or whatever, then your support kind of comes in there and you pay for it, but it's there. Open source software, it can be more difficult. The maintenance can be much more complicated. So this is not a kind of it's a swings and roundabouts decision. But what UNESCO would normally say is that there should be a diversity of licensing arrangements, but depending on where the institution was based, and we know that interactivity between different platforms is essential here, both in government and in civil society and so on. But nonetheless, that depending the place of the organization, that open source software should be available to them. And it allows also, for example, community groups to develop apps at no cost with, of course, technical assistance, which is another issue to come back to. Open education resources. So there has been some pilot attempts of that in the region, but generally those seem to be quite sparse so far. And I think here there clearly should be the possibility for government, but also for teachers themselves and the schools to share curricular lesson plans and school texts and put them on the web. Now, we all know, again, that there is always an issue about textbooks and text between, but nowadays that can, at least in part, be addressed by PDFs and online documents, even if those have to be printed because of access considerations. And then need for sites in local languages. And again, this varies between countries in the region, but overall there are, I would say, in almost every country, less sites than one would expect, let's put it that way, in the local languages. So how to encourage that, especially as that's part of the local cultures and the richness of cultures, which again has come out in several presentations in the last few days. So that was on the open data side, and this is the open markets. So in some ways, I have to say my starting point here is a USAID report from, I think it was last year, which suggested that, as one might expect, about liberalization of national markets. And I don't think this is I'm not sure, at least in many cases, I don't think markets are ready. The impression we get from the workshops, and again, as I'm saying, please, this is things that the impression I get, but you are the people who live this, and I may be getting this wrong. But that basically, there's relatively rare for local businesses to extend beyond Facebook Marketplace. So I think too quick liberalization of markets would allow a lot of online businesses to come in from the exterior, and without this sense of growing the local businesses, which I talked of before. And part of that is about the financial technology again here. In many cases, while now e-wallets are available in the countries, at least in the study group, people are still not used fully about paying for things online, and therefore that needs to be strengthened. Again, I would say before the market gets too much liberalization. So striking that balance is important, and one doesn't want to, quite frankly, leave the local economies as being entirely around Facebook Marketplace. One wants to push them onto domain names which with local tags and local domain name identification. So again, in that sense, going back to transparency in annual reports, the annual reports on the market conditions, or regular reports, let's say, on market conditions, can obviously again be a big plank to build up this sense of the market. And again, they would benefit both from more regular data and more regular publication. At the bottom then, e-government again. So again, we see quite a lot of the countries have business support pages, which is pointing exactly in this direction. But many times, and again, we'll come back again later on, do users get feedback? Is there interactive support for business? So again, this is, if you like, the kind of third stage of e-government, from just having a website to having something where you can download documents to something which is really more interactive, and you get real online support for business development. So then I want to bring up the thorny issue, let's say, of satellites. For me, I still feel, and again, this is me sticking my neck out, that satellites are the way forward. There is no way really in countries where islands and remote islands are small islands, are well distant from the central, the capital, that you can afford to have an undersea cable. Maybe the radio frequencies will allow some kind of distribution, but I think this sense of a national, building a national identity across sometimes thousands of miles of oceans through a single point speaks to me of satellites. But we understand, firstly, they're still expensive, and secondly, regulation is strongly needed to ensure that this is the whole way that the system operates is within reasonable control. But it is needed now because, again, we've heard at least one country, the sense of somebody says that every time a plane lands, it has a whole cargo of Starlink satellite conditions on it. And so things are moving fast here, and people are prepared to pay to have that connection, even in circumstances where they don't have much money. So this is happening, and obviously undersea cables still have their role, so one wouldn't want to remove that. Another thing which isn't in the indicators, but I think should be, is about, because it's essential, I think, for this area, is about uniform coverage over land and sea. You know, your countries are not just the islands, they are all the ocean that's in between them. And you should be able to move across your country the same way I can move across Canada. It may take a long time, but I'm traveling by land, but you're traveling by sea. What's the difference? And you should have a system, and satellites can do this, where you have the same internet connection, the same involvement, whether you're on a boat on the sea or whether you're on land. And that also has various important insinuations around control of the maritime environment, both environmental and in terms of fishing boats and so on. So I think that's almost, again, a question for you. This is something that I think is important. Civic engagement, I've talked about that, this sense of a national broadcast, which will go out immediately to all islands and where they can comment back. And then the second point was really, I think, a bit of a duplication. So just to illustrate this a little bit more, two maps. The light blue, of course, is Pacific, and the dark blue is Starlink. And when you look at this site and you see the Starlink satellites, there are like hundreds of them moving the whole time across the whole region. And it just gives you a sense of the extent of the coverage that is already there, which is pretty phenomenal. When you look to Pacific, this is, again, a chart, I think, of 3 or 4 years ago. And again, in terms of data gaps, it's difficult to find up-to-date coverage maps. But you can see the gaps then in the sea areas between the countries, which in a way should not be there. There should be full national coverage, at least if not regional coverage. But you know, Pacific is a different kind of satellite, more expensive to launch and so forth. So all of this needs negotiating. So now I've covered, if you like, half of the internet indicators. I've covered the rights and the legal aspect, and I've covered the openness, both in terms of markets and in terms of open data. So now I'm kind of going, if you like, almost bottom up. The access and the multi-stakeholderism are also large, in many of the messages, as it were, are about civil society and engaging them. So gender equality is a cross-cutting issue. It's down in the indicator structure under X, but I'm putting it in here already. So if you look at the data, and we'll see a bit later on, there's equal usage, broadly speaking, for men and women in the data. And so that's there. However, the qualitative information that we have received in the workshops suggests that although that is the actuality, if you see, in many ways, that there are many ways that women still are not engaged fully in discussions on the internet as they might be. So although in some countries there is women are not really represented in decision-making positions, and in some countries where they are in those positions, because of cultural norms and so on, they don't take part and they should be more assertive perhaps. There is also this whole issue that is clearly important across the world at the moment, which is online misogyny and hate speech and so forth. And although I think most countries now have some system for reporting that, it is not often enforced. And also we find that there are, because again of traditional practices and people, and as somebody has said in the workshops, in the Pacific there's a forgiving culture, that women don't report that, and therefore prosecutions don't happen, and that whole sense of enforcement doesn't happen. So that needs support there. In terms of generally, capacity building for civil society groups is extremely important. In many of the islands, of course, especially more remote islands, they don't know what the internet is or what it's about or how it can be used. But there can be important benefits to them in terms of identifying markets for local produce, in terms of prices, in terms of finance and so forth. And for all those, capacity building is necessary because it's important in providing the internet to those islands that the internet must deliver what the people in those islands want. It should not be top down. And therefore, linked to that then the links for apps which are in women's interests and whatever they may be. Universal access is a central plank of the UN and has been through WSIS and through many things for a long time. And it exists pretty much as a policy in every country, including in the Pacific. But there are then, of course, many communities, islands, which for various reasons are not connected. And we've talked already about the technical issues there. So the difficulties in cabling, in satellites, in receiving, in remote areas, in remote islands. But then this is then more about what, in the sense, would help from the consumer point of view or from the user point of view. So again, I've just talked about local content, apps, and cultural issues. So it requires often, in some countries, there's been surveys where many people have just responded and just said, we don't need the internet. And that's quite simply, I think, because they just simply don't know what it can deliver. And it is important, therefore, to have this bottom-up sense of communities and what those communities want out of the internet. And that goes back to the capacity building. Talked about remote connectivity. Affordability is always there, how to keep the costs down. People with disabilities, that again has been a global issue across the whole internet. It's easy to make the print bigger, it's easy to make the sound louder, but devices, for example, for physically handicapped or apps which deal with mental handicap are lacking in general. E-government we've talked about, and then there's a question here about universal access funds and how they're used. Again, I'll leave that and move on. I just would put this up quickly. You can't see it. It's difficult to absorb very quickly. But this is, again, I've said the statistics. These are the core statistics of internet use by age, male, female, and so on. Like I say, it shows basic equality, but there are some hiccups, let's say, for different ages, for men or women, as the case may be. There's an important about measuring access, because this is a core issue, and often the data gets mixed up. So there is coverage. The telephone companies will say, this is the coverage. This is whether you can receive a signal. Access is how many people log on. So it's just simply, can they get a connection? But then the numbers there can be complicated. I talked about tourist SIMs being included and counted as being users as a percentage of the population. People can have more than one phone. You can have a work home phone and a home phone. There can be shared phones. So all of these mean that the figures can be misleading. And then access, beyond access, there is clearly skills, so use, sorry. So you can have access to the internet, but can you use it? Do you have the skills to use it? And go back relevant applications. So from my point of view, in all this data, the core data that should be used is the data which simply is a household survey, often in this case a national census, simply saying how often or when do you use the internet and what to use it for. In terms of cross-cutting, and again, online abuse, we've come across this. The clearest institution that deals with this is the Fiji Online Safety Commission. And there are questions that are passed around about how effective this is. On the other side of the coin here, one of the interesting things here that I've heard is that when the Online Safety Commission hears a complaint, you refer it to the media platform, Facebook or whoever, to be taken down. But those platforms don't employ staff from the Pacific, and they're based in Australia. So again, the cultural sensitivity here is missing. And I think there's a strong argument to say that these platforms should employ more people from the islands to really get the sense of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate here. I've talked about forgiveness culture. I've talked about, well, I haven't talked about, I think that what is clearly required here is an effective way of reporting. And I think it has to be, from my sense, a single phone number. It should be easy for people to report a problem. And the question then is, who gets that phone number, how it is treated? You know, is there an online safety commission? Is there some other institution which is responsible for receiving it? What is the role of the phone company? What is the role of government here? And then on the last point here, IDs and registration. So to what extent do you collect the data for people collecting a SIM? And how is that kept and used? Which can go back to data protection, but it also is very closely allied to who is responding and how is this taken forward. I should go, next one, okay. Lack of skills assessment, education skills, ICT in schools, countries are making progress and obviously it needs to continue. In all of this, when we talked about capacity building, one of the issues here seems to be that there is, in many countries, a lack of people with the skills to do the capacity building on technical issues and internet issues and app development. So where do we go on that? Especially given, second from the bottom, a general lack of post-secondary institutions in the countries themselves, although at the regional level, USP and other universities in the region do a good job. And that then relates again to open education resources and how those are involved. So we're on to the last dimension, multi-stakeholderism. We're in the regional IGF. The only country, as has been mentioned before, with a national IGF is Vanuatu, unless I'm much mistaken. But my first point here is that we know now that, for example, the Voice of the Pacific is heard at global climate change meetings now. People know about this happening and what's happening here. Why not the same at the global IGF? The internet is strongly involved in all these questions in climate change, but also in many senses of the Pacific, taking part in global discussions, and it should be there too. In multi-stakeholderism at the national level, there are principles of consultation and active participation, and that comes back to, as I said earlier, transparency, about providing feedback to groups who submit comments on documents, and this is the government sites again. And then how, with civil society, how to ensure that it supports local communities to get online, the hate speech, misogyny, and civil rights. Again, capacity building, lack of technical resources, and so forth. In just one final one, because I think this is very relevant in the region, e-waste, the difficulty of disposal, recycling. And again, there's been a lot of initiatives in the Pacific, a lot of plans, but as far as I can see, practice still needs to be pushed forward. Okay, so that's broadly it. So I think in building this into this big picture and what, as it were, should go out to through UNESCO, but also from the region and so on. Everyone should be connected to allow national, international exchanges and conversations and so on. Policies, initiatives to mature and grow the online economy, to get the startups building to have true online commerce rather than just marketplace. Strengthen cultural environmental values, which I know is really important to everybody here, and which the internet can enhance and strengthen by building sites and data and presentations and so forth to show the world and to show within the region the richness that is available. The global voice at COP to global voice at IGF I've mentioned, and I think all these fit nicely within the Pacific Community 2021 to 2030 regional strategy. So I think in that sense as well, such initiatives can be supportive of what you're trying to do at a regional body. Yep. So how to get there? So this is recatching what I've just said. Transparency, so data to provoke discussion, to look at the online markets, to see how they should come together. And online markets then is not just government, but businesses themselves. So they can see the business opportunities. They can see how to market themselves with a domain name from the country itself. Capacity building, civil society, the lack of technical skills, and enforcement of rights. Regulation, many things there, and I know it takes a long time to get regulation in place, But it seems like the priorities are probably data protection and then satellites, because satellites are happening and they need it now. Then a global role for the region. It's there. It's happening. It's happening at COP. It can happen at IGF. And satellites is a key, comes in back here. You are the test bed for satellites, for Starlink, because you need it more than anybody else. In other regions of the world, it's kind of a luxury or an add-on. But here, I think it's happening. So you can play a big part, both in national regulation, but also in the global attitude to as this develops. And we've already talked to this in the global IGF, and there is interest in what the Pacific is doing in that regard. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. So we're going to leave you, these are the 4 questions to start with, as it were, that we are suggesting to discuss after the tea break. But there may be other things if you, either through the email which was sent yesterday or through the print version if you have it. If you see things in the recommendations, we're happy that those should be discussed as well. We have people here as well who were in the meetings and the national teams who also will know the background to some of this debate. The other thing to say is none of this is set in stone at all. In fact, the whole purpose of this meeting is we want your opinions. We want to have this truly reflecting you, not me. And therefore, comments that you have will be gratefully received by email or any other way you care to submit them. I can jump quickly to the thank you slide. So these are the recommendations in the report, but too many. So you can see Tatovik's email down at the bottom there. So we've just got 5 minutes before the next break. Are there any immediate questions for either of us? Does this make sense? I know it's a bit of a rush. As we said, there are in whole there are 300 indicators, but there are 100 core and so on. So there are things obviously we've skipped over. There are things which are in both fuller reports, both at national and regional level, which are still kind of under editing and under revision and so on. But if it doesn't make sense or big questions, please, this is a good point. Thank you.
So no questions before we break regarding the presentation and the findings, summary of the findings of the report?
Please, thank you. Just get to the mic.
Thanks for your presentation. My question is around stakeholder engagement in the respective countries. For example, while some of the data is accessible on the internet, did you also work with, for example, SPC has a data hub which collects a lot of data across the region? I'm just curious, was that also part of this report in terms of some of the work that some of the regional organizations are also doing in correlation to the metrics for digital policy and digital transformation?
Okay, since no other hands at the moment, but just quickly, yes, we did that. There are 2 things which I would kind of qualify that with. Firstly, we wanted to go with national data. because essentially these are national reports for national policy. And I think national policy development has to be supported by national data. And that's why, again, I showed the census and the mixed data and so forth. But obviously SPC does an amazing job on many of these areas, which is really important. I think that's the main thing. I think there's something else, but it's slipped my mind. If I come back on it, I'll remember.
The answer was yes.
Yes. Sorry.
We have test. We have.
Just a follow-up question. So are you saying or not saying that the data hub that is housed at one of these regional organizations does not influence national policies while also linked to some of the SDG goals in terms of not using the, is that what you're saying or not saying? Sorry, so with the regional data hub, are you saying that the data that's being used or collated there cannot be used to influence national policy?
No, not at all. It's not about the quality of the data, it's about the ownership and the ownership of the reports as well. So that I think it's important that there are many organisations in different regions who produce extremely good regional analysis, and SPC is one of them. But it's about in supporting and driving forward national policy. I think national data should be there, and often you can also put it this way: the regional data, just like international data, is national data. No, if there's no data at the national level, there's no data at the regional level, because you can only collect data at the national level. So it needs to be, the regional data can often be, the regional data can often be processed or refined or improved on the national data because it's cleaned and various things improvements are made. But fundamentally, if you're producing a new legislation or new policies around universal access, I would say you probably want to ensure that the data that you have is coming from your national statistics agency and that it reflects the situation. And also what I'm saying is that not only that, but you would want to have in there as well data from the telephone companies and or the regulator, so that should be within that national forum. And it just speaks more clearly if it's national, and it enables you to go back to the National Statistics Agency and question them or improve the data. So all of those elements, I think, are there. So as I said, I think the SPC data is extremely good and is important and fills in gaps for countries that don't have, where the data is more difficult, let's say, but nonetheless, and lastly, where those gaps exist, the emphasis on national data encourages those countries to have those national surveys and to say that they should be looking at that. So it's not a question of the quality of the data. It's about the policy and the policy development within the countries.
Thank you. Can I just add to what Simon and Taufik has said? Thank you so much for that. I think there might be some misunderstanding on, there must be a lot of questions. But just to clarify on that question, I'll give an example for Vanuatu. The Director General for the Prime Minister in Vanuatu signed off on this exercise before it even took place. Before even UNESCO started the exercise. So it was a decision by the government to have this gap analysis by UNESCO. So that's why they carried it out with local support, and contact you to the national governments. But I think that there could be a question, Simon and Tatifik. I know you mentioned that Tatifik mentioned that the 5 countries were selected because they are under Fiji, but the other islands might have a question like, why are they not having this exercise happening in their countries, and will it happen in the future? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. As you mentioned, the case of Vanuatu, I must also say that this project has been officially endorsed by the government of all the 5 countries. So as I said, it's a voluntary process, and UNESCO does not just do the assessment. UNESCO provides support to the national stakeholders to do the assessment at the request of whether it's government or whether the national stakeholders. But in any case, as an intergovernmental organization, we do work with the ministry, with the government, also to ensure the process. But again, you know that there have been many projects that have been implemented by, for example, the resident coordinators of the UN Resident Coordinator Office or other UN agencies covering different regions, sub-regions of the region. I mentioned that, for example, there is another project currently ongoing, for example, for the North Pacific with different components. But regardless of whether there is a project already developed or not, any country that is interested in conducting the assessment can reach out to me. So I am the focal point for the IUI assessments. So they can reach out to me, and we can see together how to initiate the assessment in your respective countries, regardless of whether there is a wider project or not. So this is how we work. Countries just express their interest, and then we see together how to start the implementation. I think there are actually very few countries that have implemented the assessment in the framework of a bigger project. There are cases, but there are a number of countries that just initiated the assessment outside of any global initiative or regional initiative.
Thank you. Thank you. Our time is 15:36. We are due for tea, but we'll come back with more discussions on this. I think that will allow you the floor to continue to engage and ask questions. I know Wet wants to answer. Can you make that the last one now before we?
Was there a time frame? So this is the first one. Did you say that you were going to do this for the next 5 years? Or is this the only one? Because it's a lot of work. And I'm wondering if this is the first and then you're going to do, like 3 more or 2 more? Or was this a one-off?
I am not sure which slide you're referring to about the next 5 years. So I'm not sure, but just to clarify, so this project was a one-off project, the bigger UN SDG Fund project, which is implemented by 6 UN agencies, and actually it's running until February. But what we try and encourage to do through the recommendations and also through this discussion, and UNESCO will take forward the recommendations and the discussion we have here. We will be talking to other regional or international organizations, and we're having discussions with also other entities and governments to see how we can carry the recommendations forward to ensure the continuity rather than stopping here. And all of this is discussions, and the efforts to have this vision and way forward is aimed at that, just to make sure that there is continuity and it's not stopping here. And also I must highlight that, again, this is a very very comprehensive framework, and UNESCO does not necessarily have mandate in all the areas where the recommendations arise. So it's also for other organizations to take up and move forward with the recommendations, working with the countries. But the project itself, yes, is running until February.
And I mean, the other point to make, I think, as Tatvik said at the beginning, is that essentially, for the most part, this has been, these assessments have been carried out by countries on a voluntary basis, so that there's nothing stopping a country that wants to carry this out for putting it forward. However, that's not to say that UNESCO will necessarily have the resources to cover that, so the country might well have to find the resources to enable it to carry that out. From UNESCO's point of view, it may not need much resources at the UNESCO level, as it were, to support that. But in terms of bringing together stakeholders, collecting the data, that would be something that the country would, in terms of resourcing, would have to address. I think that's okay.
Thank you. I think we'll go for a break now until is it 30 minutes break? Yeah. So let's have a 30 minutes break. Yeah. And then come back. We do have a lot of questions. Please, if you don't have access to this report, I think Tatvik's email is there. Send her an email to have a copy so that you can also provide a feedback, especially those of us who have not had this, who have had this report from our countries, and you can ask questions, you can look at the report and then continue to engage in the next session. Thank you.